States. So,
good morning to everybody. I assume there is kind of a combination here of many programs you're interested in, and we should pitch Tel Aviv University in a variety of manners, and I'm one of those who's supposed to pitch it. So notwithstanding what I say right now, I can tell you it's a very good place, and I'm sure you will all join us and see for yourself, regardless of my comments today. The international programs that we are having right now is indeed very challenging to many of us and quite an exhilarating experience, because you will find at the Tel Aviv University there have been really some very interesting developments in the last few years in terms of the possibilities in programs and in terms of the options that you will get both in the political science department, international politics, conflict resolution, etc. And you can really choose among lots of options here, and in fact some of them are quite overlapping, so you can increase and embellish your abilities as you come from abroad. For myself, I share time between Tel Aviv University and Georgetown. I have a dual appointment. I'm the head of the diplomacy program here and at Georgetown University as well. And what I will talk to you today about, I was asked to talk to you about, is one of those conundrums and those challenges that Israel is facing, which is the issues of to what extent Israel can define itself as a Jewish and democratic state. It's interesting that it bothers Israelis at all that they are constantly called upon to ask, is it possible to reconcile Jewish and democratic state? Why do they even ask the question? It's a very interesting question, because there is an assumption out there that democracy cannot itself be identified with ethnicity or with religious identity, which is it's no based in any sort of common wisdom, but nevertheless it's a question, because the big question is to what extent the very essence of a state, defined as ethno-religious state for its people, is in some way compromising the issue of democracy. That's the big question. To what extent, when you define the body politique and members of the state as member of an ethnos, do you really compromise the liberal principle, especially vis-à-vis those who are not members of the same ethno-religious community? Now, this is not Israel's only question. Many countries are like this, but in Israel it's a very acute question, because the question is related to both our Arab members of the community, those who are not members of the national community, and of course because Israel is in an ongoing conflict with the Arab Palestinian world in terms of the rights, of the very essence of the rights of the legitimacy of the state, and the very issue of who belongs to the state. To what extent a state can include those who are residing abroad as part of the nation, and those who are residing in the state are not part of the nation. As I said, and I don't want to elaborate too much because I don't have too much time, but these are questions that are part and parcel of many other nations. But in Israel, it is a very important issue. Now let me make several points here. First of all, the Israeli state, or the Jewish Israeli state, was created, as you all know, in 1948. And it was created with the United Nations decision to partition the land here to two states in 1947, the November 1947 decision. People forget that this was a decision. And the decision was to partition the land to two entities, a Jewish state and an Arab state. That's how they define it. And indeed, there was a Jewish state was established. There was a war. The Jewish state and the Arab state was not established because of the war. Variety of interpretation you will hear, why the war was erupted, because whatever it is, for the Palestinians, of course, it is regarded as a Nakba, as the disaster for the Palestinians who were not able to establish their own independent state. For the Jewish state, of course, it was established as the heroic moment of modern Zionism. The cultivation of this kind of state was very much the new assembly of all the Jews, wherever they are, regarding these issues of recreating Jewish sovereignty, because the lack of sovereignty was always the main issue that did not enable the Jewish people to exist, notwithstanding the desires to assimilate in other places perhaps. And they did have this desire in many places in Europe. They did have this desire to assimilate. And they were hoping that emancipation in Europe, that is, the enlargement of rights in Europe, will not label them as minorities. Regardless of that, they were labeled as minorities because all the other states remain as ethno-national state that the Jewish and democratic state now is asking, can we allow to do it? But they all did remain like that. And indeed, right now, the same question is rising again in Europe. To To what extent Europe can remain itself not as ethno-national state, but rather as multi-ethnic state, as we want, or something like what they call multicultural state. We saw David Cameron expression this week, we saw Angela Merkel expression, and we all know what Sarkozy thinks about these things. But these are very important issues that the Jews have always thought about, and always experienced, both as exilic people, and as, of course, people who are now in sovereign, who join a sovereign body. But within the sovereign body, of course, there are lots of questions remaining. One is the essence of the state, which is an internal Jewish question. Internal Jewish question in the sense, what is the essence of the Jewish state? To what extent the Jewish state should be a religious state, should be Jewish in terms of what traits will Judaism entail within the Jewish state. This is something which is constantly being debated. And it has been debated for many, many years. From the time of the Jewish founders of the state, from Herzl to Echad Ha'am and others, who did not really realize what will it mean. And within the Jewish state, of course, there is a constant debate between those who consider Judaism as part and parcel of a long tradition, with lots of course, heritage, etc., but not a religious creed, and those who consider the religious creed as something which would be much more dominating the state. And the variations are great between total secular, so to speak, and total orthodox, we call them as such. And this is one aspect of the state which has not been resolved. And this is this aspect of the nature of the Jewish state. This aspect also has, notwithstanding the Arab minority, which we'll get to in a second, also has lots of questions related to the democratic character of the state. Because to what extent democratic character of a state entails lots of things. For example, a separation of religion and state. There are those who consider the very essence of democracy as the separation of religion and state. But of course many democracies do not separate religion and state. They do not need to do so because no one is challenging the very essence. In Israel it is being asked time and again. Do we really have to separate religion and state in order to have a democratic state? We don't have to do so if the challenge is not coming to the fore. Now, but nevertheless, these issues are coming to the fore for good reason. Because on the one hand, if you have religious practices that are undercutting liberal democratic rights, for example, if you don't want women to drive in buses, which is now a big question in Israel, can you imagine? Or not riding in buses in the front of the bus, as some ultra-Orthodox want in Jerusalem or other places. The Supreme Court will have to intervene and either enforce the law that these are of course laws which cannot be accepted in any democracy and liberal democracy. There are those questions related to residence. Can you have special neighborhoods that should close on Shabbat or not? To what extent people have the rights to drive in every street? Is this a liberal right? To what extent shops should be open or not? These are questions that the state has to take into consideration. And this leads to lots of debates in Israel. And the Israeli polity is such because of its dynamic, because of its demographic, because of the changes of demographic, that these issues will continue to undercut lots of, or to inform many of the debates that we have in the political realm. Because the demography of Israel is such that today the ultra-Orthodox community is the fastest growing community and undoubtedly will be more and more visible within the Israeli system. As we now know, in Jerusalem every second kid is an ultra-Orthodox. In the country at large, they say now in the education system every third kid is a religious or ultra-religious. In that respect, it will change the nature of the state, and these are debates that are likely to accelerate and be more intense in the years to come. So this is one issue related to the Jewish character of the state. And of course, there is a big other sort of related issue, to what extent the state itself is Jewish in the sense of its heritage. What does it carry? What's the ethos of the state? What's the ethos? The ethos of the state from the beginning was the ethos of the redemption of the Jews from the exilic moment. The exilic moment, that is, that until Israel was established as a sovereign state, 2,000 years there was no sovereignty for the Jews. And the lack of sovereignty was perceived by the Zionists, and still is the ethos of the state, as the most disastrous sort of phenomena in Jewish life. There were those, of course, who had this vision, the Jewish universalism, notwithstanding sovereignty or not, we don't need that. But in the diaspora already, there were lots of debates between various schools of thought. Between those who were integrationists, who find, for example, they can establish themselves in America, and they can have sort of what they call the golden Medina, the new golden state, because they could become part and parcel of a new nation. But even there, you can see that there are lots of debate to what extent they can retain their Jewishness, notwithstanding the fact that America is, of course, allowing them to retain it, but under the assimilative capacities of America, can you be Jewish if you're not religious? What does it mean to be Jew in America today? It's a big question. They changed the definition in America as well. Why they changed it? Because suddenly there are the Reform Jews, suddenly paternal descent is becoming part of sort of like, let's enlarge the Jewish community like that, and others are decrying assimilation. So the very essence of Jewishness is changing in America. And Israel is becoming the beacon of what Jewishness is all about, which is interesting. Because for the first time, Israel has the vast majority of Jews in the world. If not now, in 5, 10 years, we will be the majority of the world. And that's interesting. We are now 13.5 million people Jewish in the world. And Israel is fast becoming the Jewish sort of like bastion of Jewish life in the world. So Israel will define for the diaspora as well. And the diaspora don't like it sometimes. They don't like that ultra-Orthodox rabbi or Orthodox rabbi define for Reform rabbi that they are not rabbis. And nevertheless, and that's the key factor, that the Reform rabbis and conservative rabbis that I study are always in a march of chasing the Orthodox rabbis because they do not have any clout within their own community, because if the community assimilate, how much they can give interpretation outside the boundaries of the religion. Religion here is a very important essence. In Israel, when Ben Gurion was establishing the state, establishing with others, they were trying to define religion in a different fashion. They created it as a civic religion. What does it mean, civic religion? It's not the religious practices, but rather the heritage. We celebrate Jewish holidays as part of our calendar. We kind of like enacted the Hebrew language, which was the most important factor in the revival of the Jewish nationalism, because everybody speaks the same language. It's a common trait of the Jewish people here. And non-Jews, of course, as well, but the Jewish people. And that enables sort of creating kind of a focus of the recovery of the Jews regardless of their religious practices, but this national mission was the key for Jewish identity. And that was becoming sort of like when you kind of adopt whatever needs to be adopted, especially from the time of the prophets. You don't adopt anything for the legacy from the time of the failing of the diaspora. But with the ultra-religious becoming more powerful, practices of the diaspora of ultra-religious also became enacted into this. So you can see it's very complex, but it's very interesting because it's a constantly dynamic issues of identity coming to the fore. And then, of course, there is the issue of legality. Because the legality of a state and a democratic state is a very important issue. And legality in the democratic state is informed by liberal principles. And liberal principles themselves are informed by the idea that everybody is equal by the law. You cannot sort of like compromise anyone's interest by defining them as lesser in terms of the nation. But in Israel we do, and many other countries do as well. But in what respect? By saying, okay, the primary purpose of the state is for the Jews. So those who do not reside in the state have an immediate access to the state. Just as the Germans will have the Aussiedler, or the Japanese will have the returnees for them, or the Irish will have that, or the Poles, and so on. But in Israel it's a big question because of the idea of who are the returnees, to what extent they return really. The returnees are the Jews who are stepping up, coming to Israel, making aliyah, is another sort of term which has sort of like moving up in their existence. Making aliyah to Israel is kind of like, it's not just an idea of migration. It's an idea of, in many ways, improving your Jewish existence. That's the essence of it. And leaving Israel, yerida, is kind of like stepping down in the level of existence. So you can see these are the terms that are also informing the national ethos of the state. With regard to these issues, of course, there are lots of questions are remaining and outstanding questions because there is an unsolved issue here between Israelis and Palestinians in particular. First of all, Israel is still controlling lands and what known as the West Bank or Judea and Samaria for those who are the Jews who are settling there. That is not part and parcel of the state at all. So this is something which is, of course, a deficit of Israel's democratic existence. As long as the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict is not resolved and they are under Israel's occupation or Israel's domination without any democratic rights, obviously they are lacking the basic rights of democracy. And that's something which constantly hammered in Israel's legitimacy and will continue to undercut Israel's legitimacy as long as they don't solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. How they will solve it, to what extent there will be a solution, it's a different question. And of course, you will be here for several years to see that this, we hope in your days it will be solved, inshallah. But the likelihood is not great. And I hope during your tenure at Tel Aviv University everything will be solved because maybe you will come with some new ideas. But this is a huge issue. Aside from the Palestinians, of course, as I said, there are other communities in Israel who are not Jewish. Some of which are part and parcel of the Israeli experience, even though they will maintain not getting the benefits of the Jewish communities. For example, the Jewish community, the vast majority of the Jewish community, many regard the state as their own, the state serving in the Israeli army all the way up to the highest levels in the army. But nevertheless, some will say there's still great sort of distances between the Jewish community, which more or less, as I understand, 110,000, 120,000 strong, and the Jewish community. To what extent they can be, but this is a much stronger ties, one can argue, undoubtedly. But there are those Muslim communities especially, less Christian now, because the Christian community in the Middle East is being depleted fast, but nevertheless, that are not part of the Israeli state. They may regard themselves totally as Palestinians. So the big question is, to what extent you will normalize the state? There are those who argue, among Arab Israelis in particular, that the state should be for all its citizens. Ignore the very definition of the state and create a state for all its citizens, create a new sort of theme around which everybody will coalesce, regardless of ethnos and religion. This is, of course, a creed that is totally liberal. The question is then, do you have a Palestinian state in the future without having a Jewish state? You have only a state of all its citizens? These debates are constantly coming to the fore. Is it visible? Is it something that undercut the very essence of Zionism? And so on and so forth. So you can see we are in a conundrum, but we like to be in conundrum, because this country is constantly developing through conundrums. We do not develop through periods of calmness. Calmness is very much against the Jewish trait. If you're calm, something is wrong with you. Only last week, the newspaper prescribed that every Israeli can get Ritalin for free. So if you come to Israel, you should know you can get drinks for free and Ritalin for free. Drugging Israel, there used to be a book by Fukuyama, Drugging America, now it's Drugging Israel. Everybody may forget about their identity. They will be diluted more than they even are right now. So you can join the club. It's a great issues to be studying in a comparative fashion. We do it constantly. Many scholars at Tel Aviv University and our department and many other departments are dealing with issues of identity, ethnicity, nationalism. These are exciting ideas here because you can see them as they evolve. You can compare them. We're always a good model for studying this. And I absolutely wishing you all the best coming to this university and to these programs. You will see that you can extract lots of examples here from the experiences, from the studies. Numerous faculty members will be available to you, and I, of course, will be glad to see your faces and knocking on my door and asking questions. And if you have any questions right now, I will be honored to answer them. No questions? I'm delighted to leave as well. Ciao.